Dobrý den a ahoj, já se jmenuji Ladislav Sedlák, jsem instruktorem Krav Maga Academy a dneska tady mám na rozhovor vzácného hosta, Dorothe Trassl. Je to psycholožka, terapeutka, cvičitelka jógy. Strávila dlouhá léta v Jihoafrické republice, kde pracovala právě jako terapeutka pro charitativní organizaci a dlouhodobě se zabývá práci s traumaty, to je její specializace a řešení traumat, hojení traumat. Dorothe, welcome once again.
Thank you very much.
So I would like to ask you at the very beginning, what is the definition of trauma to you? And is there a consensus regarding the definition?
Actually, when I introduce the concepts, I usually talk about trauma being something that was too fast, too much, too long, or too early.
Right.
So basically something that had an overwhelming quality. The psychological definition of trauma can be a little bit more narrow, which is something that was overwhelming your resources at that time. But I think if we widen that concept a little bit, we can include more experiences that for us as humans happen and that can actually have an effect on our life afterwards. So it's not strictly the psychological narrow definitions, but more the widened concept.
Okay, so to my understanding, there are traumas caused by single events or actions, or traumas caused by actions or events that happen repeatedly. Is there, and I'm sure there is, can you define the difference between these two in terms of the characteristics, the healing, the consequences?
Yes. And I would love to, before I take them apart, talk about what's common in both of them.
Right.
So what is happening in both of them is actually that because our system, our nervous system and our body's ability to cope with the experience is overridden, it's too much, we resort to a survival function of our brain and of our body. So that's common, that is in both, in the one-time event and in the ongoing trauma. Now the difference is when I have an once-off event, like we have an accident or we have somebody violating me and my boundaries, then I can deal with that in a different way because it depends on how do I immediately, when that event happened, how do I immediately help myself to go back into my psychological and physical integrity, meaning how can I offload the activation that happens in the system from the body, and how can I find my own power, my resting point again inside of me for the one-time event. Now when we have something like childhood developmental trauma, which is like an ongoing experience of either overwhelming or neglect, which can also happen, then it has a lasting effect on the setup of my nervous system and my body. So for example, yes, you can lose trust in men, life, cars, horses when you have a one-time event. But when you are growing up in a family where your psychological needs and your physical needs were not met, it can be that it has a lasting effect on your worldview. And what we unfortunately find a lot is that children who experience neglect in childhood, emotional neglect, that they actually lose trust in themselves. So it's not so much that they're actually stopping to trust their parents, but they stop to trust themselves. So they leave themselves behind and step into a adapted version, like a role self. And that can have very detrimental effects on your health and actually on your happiness.
Regarding the next question, you already started talking about it a little bit. You mentioned it, the childhood trauma. I was going to ask about one more difference, and that's between the childhood trauma and the trauma that happens in adulthood. Can you specify the differences a little bit?
Yes, because when we are very little, so in the children, when you are born in your family, your developing body and developing nervous system learns from your surroundings, your parents, your caregivers. Now, if my nervous system is in a toxic environment, as a child, then I'm set up to develop certain strategies to cope with life, and not all of them are healthy. And it can actually make my nervous system be stuck in a certain mode, and I'm not able to develop all my potential. And in the adulthood, I am already whoever I am. So when it happens then, I can possibly call in the support of a therapist or some other healing modality or of my other resources to deal with that and not go into post-traumatic stress disorder, but really deal with it here and now. But children don't have that option. Mm-hmm. And as a child, when you grow up in this reality, it's almost like somebody put glasses, like augmented reality, on your head, and this is how you see the world. Yeah. As an adult, you have had an experience and then something changes. But as a child, it twists your connection to yourself. Mm-hmm. And that is what is so painful then later, because you're forever looking for myself, my connection, my truth, my purpose, my strengths. What am I going to do?
Right.
And the lostness, this is probably maybe the most characteristic. As an adult, when you're already connected and something happens to you, you stay in your connections. But as a child, you feel lost, you feel alone, and you grow up with this feeling of no holding, no protection, no security, no safety, no purpose, maybe even.
Right. I'm going to ask a silly question perhaps, but does the trauma sometimes just go away, just disappear, or do you always have to take care of it?
That is a very good question. Because I'm a psychologist and I was in South Africa, based in South Africa, and there's a lot of trauma.
Right.
Now, does it just go away? I don't think so. But what can happen is that life is caretaking of you so well that even without the aid of a therapist, you have a chance to process it. So when I was looking at the Zulu community, they were using rituals, they were using drums, dancing, and community, and then the trauma can heal without being addressed head on. Okay. So the people don't have to talk about what happened, but they solve it, they process it in a different way. Mm-hmm. But that it just leaves you, I don't know, then it wasn't trauma. Because trauma is really, to just go back to the first question, trauma is when it's lodged in.
Right.
Okay, so it has an effect. If it just happens like a one-time event where you have an accident, but you can deal with it and you can process this and that it leaves and it heals and it's no problem, that's not trauma. Understood. So it doesn't have to be trauma when you are in an accident, in a fight, or when this happens. It doesn't have to be trauma. Trauma is what happens after the event. So this is maybe overwhelming, but the effect, that is the trauma.
Right, interesting. Going back to childhood trauma, what would you recommend parents in order to avoid their kids being traumatized? Like, is there a 10 commandments of parenting or common mistakes of parenting, let's say? You don't have to name 10, obviously. But, you know.
I get the point. Now, the thing is, I'm a parent myself. Of course, I'm also a daughter. And I have looked at that topic issue from both sides. So how have I experienced growing up and what was my kind of developmental trauma? And then I also, unfortunately, had to realize how I had passed my own trauma onto my children. Okay? Now, undoing this, because my children are adults, we have been working together, processing together, so my children are finding their way out of it. And of course, I own my mistakes. And if I had a recommendation for parents, it is really healing your own trauma first. So really looking at what is it that went wrong, or if it is not what went wrong, but what was missing. Because it's far more difficult to name what was not there than what was there. And here's the recommendation: to actually help your kids to grow up healthily, you actually need to see them. You need to feel them. You need to connect to them. You need to have some kind of not insight, but some awareness of the context they are living in. Because when you see and hear and watch with awareness your children and with compassion, then you will be there when they need you, and you will leave them when they don't need you. And that is the important thing, that the helicoptering over our children is just as damaging as it is to leave them neglected in the sense of, do what you want.
Yeah.
Because the children need boundaries. They need to feel where's right and where's wrong. They need us to guide them, to be the best guardian for them, in the sense that we 100% trust in their ability, in their goodness, in them being who they are, and then with them, supporting them to make their own experiences, make their mistakes, and then make up for them.
Right.
Because they need to learn that. They need to learn how to fall on the face and then stand up again.
Yeah.
And if you want to give your children one, major treasure, one gift for life, it is actually for them the certainty, the embodied knowing that there's always a safe place to come back to.
Right.
Inside themselves, with other people, and of course with you as a parent.
Yeah.
And that is, I cannot say how important the embodied feeling of safety is. Because that's what's missing in trauma then later.
Yeah.
I have no safety here, and then this happens, and then lost.
Okay. Is there anyone without trauma, or do we all suffer to some extent, minor way or severe way?
I would dare say that there are people without trauma when and if life happens, okay? Life happens to all of us.
Right.
But what we do after life happens, that is the question. So there can be people who have had really big experiences, painful experiences. The pain is not optional, so pain will happen, okay? But the suffering is optional. So how do I deal with it? That is up to me and my resources. And of course you have parents who have healed with their children and given them enough resilience to deal with life. So it's not that life doesn't happen. So you have your pains, your scars, your wounds. Yeah, but they don't have to be traumatic. It doesn't have to be trauma. Trauma always means that you are debilitated, that your ability to cope is taken away. That's the difference. So if you have children, in Africa there were children without parents living on the street, but they had resilience. So they were not unhappy. They were actually very happy. Okay? And they did not need to go down the route of drugs and criminality because they had the support in them.
I was told that you do have a martial arts experience. So how can martial arts training contribute to our well-being, let's say, to healing? What can we as instructors do to contribute, or at least to be less ambitious, not to make things worse than they are?
Firstly, my martial arts experience is limited in the sense that when I was a teenager, I had experiences of abuse, which could have been potentially traumatic. And I was joining a course that was held and given, or gifted actually, by our local police. It was self-defense for women. And when I went into that environment, and the teacher, of course, he was a big male, but it did not produce more trauma, but it produced the trust in the goodness and in the integrity that is possible. And what it gave me personally, that martial arts training, was I felt safe with expressing myself. I learned to feel my boundaries. I learned to say no. I learned to accept when my powers are not enough, when my strength is overridden. I learned to say stop and no. It's enough. But you need to learn your boundaries inside and outside. So where am I not able to deal with the situation alone anymore? When do I need to ask for help? And when am I strong enough? And of course it increased my strength physically, but especially emotionally. Because I learned that I might not be strong enough, but I can move myself in a way that I can deal with life. So the feeling of being in control and feeling safe in my own body was like an enormous gift, because I did not feel safe in my body anymore. But with the training and with the intense, you know how it is, the intensity also of the emotionality in it, but in a safe context. That was what gave me the strength and the safety that I needed. And my recommendation for trainers would always be, I mean, you do that anyway, I guess, safety first. So establish the safety not only on the mat, so what are the codes, you know, what are we doing, what are we not doing, but also establish the internal, the psychological safety. So I'm safe here, you know, I can be here, I can be myself, I can make mistakes, and I can make up for them, and I'm in a group, so I'm connected to my tribe, if you so wish, because that's what we also need as human beings. We need the connection.
Yeah. I'd like to move to like current events. You know, we're living in the, some people call it COVID era, and there are, I think, potential trauma everywhere. Although the murder rate is going down, the domestic violence, for example, is skyrocketing these days, and people are losing their jobs, and I think it's relatively easy to fall into this trap of victim mentality. So how do you avoid this nowadays? That's a tough question.
It is a tough question because it also depends on how willing are you to actually step out of your comfort zone. Because what I saw, and I'm practicing, I'm a therapist in my private practice, and of course the numbers of clients went up, and depression, anxiety, suicide, domestic violence, because people don't have an escape route anymore for the painful feelings inside. And they have nothing to do with COVID. They have everything to do with you not having coping strategies anymore. So you can't distract yourself, you can't go out, so you are confronted with your own inner conflict. You have to face your own inner demons, and here's the question, are you willing to do that? When you are willing to do that, there's so much help outside. You can connect, social media, telephone, you can find therapists. It can be online, it doesn't have to be live and in person. But are you willing to do that? Because we have the tendency, or if we are not aware of what's going on inside, we have the tendency to project that outward. And then you are at fault, right? And then I start a fight. So I externalize my conflict onto you, and then I can deal with it. But I can't deal with it that way because it's my own conflict. So are you willing to look at that, and are you willing to stretch your comfort zone? Then yes, fantastic, go ahead, do that. Look at your own emotions, process them, sit with them. Don't spill them outside, but look at them inside. And then also physical activity, because that's the other thing. People were sitting at home not moving anymore. You have to move. And when I'm doing workshops, I'm teaching shaking and breathing and techniques of yoga that help you to actually get the emotionality moving through the body instead of you being stuck and constipated in that pain. So move inside and move emotionally, and connect if you have to. So asking for help is not a bad thing. It's actually very intelligent.
Okay. Which brings me to the next question, and that's, if there is a person listening to this interview, and the person is like, okay, this is me. This is the exact thing that I'm experiencing right now. Again, what would you advise to them?
Dare to ask for help. So dare to connect to your community, friends, family, or to a therapist. And my recommendation is, depending on what your preference is, but my recommendation is also, when it's really trauma, to connect to somebody who can also deliver somatic treatment. So meaning including your body, because we are a body mind, and trauma is lodged in your nervous system. It's not talking style that you can actually alleviate it best. I did talking style therapy, but coming from the mind, trying to reach the emotions and then liberating the body doesn't work so well, and it takes long. But if you turn the whole thing around and you let the body really release, also with trembling and shaking or movement, and then you can feel the emotions because you've got the container for that, then the mind can clear, the thinking can clear, and then actually something changes profoundly, but from the inside and not... So find somatic therapies, find help. And of course there's stuff online, you can find YouTube and Google everything. And I also have a body-mind online course, which is actually not only naming the different issues, but also giving meditations, giving relief, giving shaking, breathing techniques. And it's not one tool, in the toolbox. It's not one tool, one hammer that solves the problem, but it's really about finding the right tool. And this gives you, that online course, for example, that gives you a whole toolbox of what's needed in which situation, because it's not always the same. And then, of course, good therapists out there, attend a workshop, learn more about it, read some good books, do martial arts.
Okay. Last question that I assume I should have asked first is about your life, because it's really, the life story is really fascinating. So can you just point like milestones that influence you most?
When I was growing up, it wasn't the easiest of all times. So I experienced developmental trauma. I had very well-meaning parents. I was a loved child. I knew that, but I couldn't feel it. Because emotionally, my parents were not able to be connected with me. They had experienced the loss of a child before, and there was a lot of sadness and grief in the family, and I did not know what to do with it as a child. You know, I was growing up and I didn't understand it, but my body was drinking it in. And then I was a rebellious teenager, and I made a lot of mistakes, including drugs and everything you don't do. And I had to find my way to the edge to really feel, oh my God, that's it. I'm done with life. And I was really standing at the edge of the abyss. But something inside called me back and said, well, if you want to throw your life away, then give it to somebody else if somebody else can use it. So be of service to somebody else. And then I started to get my act together. I was seeking therapy, and then when I was studying psychology myself, because I was put into this welfare organization. You have to work practically very quickly in South Africa if you do clinical psychology. And I was in that welfare organization hotline helping people, and I realized, wow, the talking style is not enough. So I actually need some more. And when I was looking around, finding the Zulus with their shaking, finding the yoga techniques, I was actually starting to really heal myself. So it wasn't the talking style therapies, but it was the somatic, the movement that actually was the turning point for my life. And then, well, it was just growing and getting better and better. And I'm now really so passionate about life. I did not know what to do with my life when I was smaller, younger. But now I'm really like, on fire. I love life. And I wish that people could really realize what a gift that is.
Yeah.
How amazing it is to be alive.
Okay. Thank you so much for the interview. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.